Hello and welcome. I'm with Jermaine Francis and we're at Hapax Living Room, immersed in Jermaine's new show called A Post-Industrial Dreamscape. And I'm here to talk to Jermaine about how the exhibition came about and the themes that extend from it. So hello Jermaine, thanks for having me in your living room.
Sorry, I got short shorts on today.
Yeah, listen, I wish I had to, I'll be honest with you. But okay, so could you give me, let's start at the beginning and just tell me when this project started and how it started and what was the inspiration for it.
So when I think about it, the project started probably when I was born, in a weird way.
Yeah.
Because it's a sort of a mediation of and trying to contextualize an experience growing up in Britain, and I would say because I'm born after a particular period of post-industrial Britain, but also articulating it through or in sort of interrogating the word or through visual culture, and sort of like a sort of cacophony. I mean, the actual installation is almost kind of an iteration of the main piece, which is the video piece.
Yeah, so why don't, and I should have said this, why don't you tell me what Post-Industrial Dreamscape is in terms of its physical manifestation?
I guess in terms of its physical manifestation, it is like like as I said, it's an exploration through a kind of working class kind of journey, or through spaces which are probably more associated with working classes, through different spaces like the dance floor, the factory, or labour, as in sense of physical labour, which can also mean workplace, the body, in terms of also TV. You know, I was a real TV kid, and through property, housing. And I cited these three things. When you look at the political landscape and you look at elections, you know, housing, and also the idea of immigration, multiculturalism, nationalism, belonging, and who is seen as British, are always wrapped up. When you look at political manifestos, housing will be one of them, for sure. The NHS, public services, you know, that's always something there, and the idea of basically identity and immigration, and they always seem to be in these manifestos, and sort of cited that thing as something that seems to be consistent through that. So it's a video piece that takes you on a kind of hallucinogenic journey through this different material, and also thinking about how we consume material now, visual material, is through tablets, through screens, and I wanted to, and archival material as well, and sort of placing it in the way that also we might experience it, the slide, the glide, the glitch, this movement where we get snippets of things, and then we have to, because it's like when you see people's stories, you'll have a story of like someone's cat, then someone's kind of like exhibition, and then there'll be like, you know, violence, you know, next to something that's kind of benign, and atrocities. And it's sort of trying to use that language and the aesthetics of that.
So is it so? You've described the almost a depiction of your lifetime against a cultural, political, industrial backdrop. Is that?
I guess that's one way of articulating it. Yeah.
In a very plain way. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of like say that's the theme.
No, but
if
in a kind of
in a sort of temporal way. You know, it's like this is where we're put. It's a lot to do with your experience as well.
Well, it comes from a temporality that, you know, I would suggest is a black temporality, and the reason why I say it's that is because of the things that you would consider. So the working class experience or work is always seems to be shaped politically. It's but very much as something of, or the problems of a post-industrial kind of experience or age which we're going through. The people who are affected in the West or in this country, it's being depicted as just people who are white and working class. But we know that the working classes are not a monoculture. So what I'm trying to suggest is that it's much more rich and it's much more mixed and complex as that. But what happens when you're someone from my background is having to negotiate and deal with those experiences? There are things that I will have to consider and negotiate which other groups will not, or other demographics will not. And it's about also dealing with those political, because it does be, you know, you see the way that also the media, politicians will take issues and use them for their own kind of political gain, almost to distract from the realities of policy that has been created or produced by those administrations or those governments. And there is like the soundtrack itself is mimicking what is also because also the visual strategies is like a frequency and a frequency that flows through, and that frequency is almost like a metaphor for a frequency that seems to appear, and it refers, I guess, to, like, you know, Paul Gilroy's you know, book on post-colonial melancholy and all these other things that sit within this idea of what is Englishness or English nationalism. And the main thing is that immigrants take from a particular demographic, which is a white demographic. And what I'm doing is basically inserting the other reality or the alternative narrative of that, of a history of where immigrants, and I'm coming from, let's say, more Afro-Caribbean kind of perspective, because that's where my parents are originally from, and my grandparents, who are the Windrush, which will be the anniversary this weekend, of something where we have given to this country and be part of, and that legacy, and how the idea of belonging, identity is always, for me, slightly an instability.
Okay, so if I can sort of just for the viewers say that, you know, the exhibition, if you like, or the body of work is 2 films.
Yeah, 2 video pieces. Yeah.
Two video pieces with soundtrack. Well, one with the soundtrack, and the idea is that you, as you watch it, you've been putting it in sort of fairly prosaic terms, but as the experience of watching the films is to make you feel unsettled, and so you're hearing these music, sounds, archive. You're seeing archive footage, and I know that from your previous bodies of work that you have a sort of, if you like, it's not a motif, but it's a strategy, I suppose, of unsettling the viewer, even to the point of slightly making them feel uncomfortable by some element in the image. And in a previous body of work, Pleasant Land, you showed huge still image that kind of almost looked like it was moving, because it was one image superimposed on another in a way that just jarred, you know. And then in post Industrial Dreamscape, you've got similar strategy, but this time in moving image, and it has the effect of making me feel, somebody who, let's say, who's outside of the story, feel disquieted, anxious, or all of those things. Is that intended?
Yeah, and I guess also it's about who the audience is and experience it. I'm very much into the idea of sensation, and
Right.
I'm very much into this visual idea of a feeling or a sensation that you can invoke in a viewer. I'd always been interested in the ideas of, I guess, the sublime, even though it has its origins of that sort of idea of concept is problematic in the terms of how it was created, what it was created out of, which was racial hierarchy. Can
you just talk about that a bit? Just go into that a little bit more?
The sublime is, in simple terms, is about the idea of going into nature, into this Abenissic's experience, which is basically indescribable in words, which leads to a kind of feeling of fear and unease, and that was used as a kind of an aesthetic kind of framework for painting in Romanticism and other painting forms, Edmund Burke, and then you've got Immanuel Kant's idea of the sublime, and his ideas were very much formed out of a sort of racial hierarchy of who can experience those things. And Turner's slave ship paintings really was always an important painting to me, because Ruskin was saying that was the ultimate embodiment of the sublime, but he only really refers to I'm talking about not Turner Ruskin, very limited about who's depicted, and it's the depiction of Zong massacre, where slaves were thrown overboard for insurance purposes. And for me, what does that mean as a sensation of sublime, as a black person, young black kid, when he looked at that painting for the first time? What was the sensation of me knowing what's depicted? Beyond the aesthetics, it's also about what's being represented. And I guess you have, for me, the leotard sublime presenting representing and representable in some ways was like, okay, if you see this work and you're black or basically brown and you see what's going on, you will understand the uneasiness and what that means. And if you're outside of that unease and that anxiousness may still be felt by you. You can't experience what I'm experiencing fully. I can sort of tell you and whatever, but that sense of unease, instability, questioning is a part of that anxiousness. And I guess the second piece, which is what you mentioned, the other video piece, which has a audio piece, which is me creating this journal, which is kind of pretty much biographical, but is said through an alter ego in order to take you on this time travel, is meant to do that. So I'm very much into that idea of making the viewer question what's in front to interrogate, and that whatever audience you come from, that will be slightly different in your experience of it. Some people will look at this video who are, for example, there is an image of a group of women dancing on a dance floor in kind of unison, which is in videos. That was at my dad's wake. So personally, that has some memories, but also it has joy and resistance of these black women dancing in unison and together, and this metaphor of a kind of a sort of resistance as well. So people would recognise that.
Yeah. So can we just go sort of like tie this into the idea of frequencies and your own journey, if you can call that, of becoming aware of the issues that you're dealing with today. So, I mean, if I can take you back to being a kid in the black country, presumably you weren't as aware of all of these issues, but over a course of time, you tuned into your own culture, your own position in British society, let's say, and how uncomfortable or comfortable that might make you feel, and then the frequencies. And I know something that you've talked about before, this phrase hauntology. Can you kind of bring those two things together, your own progression, plus the recognition of these so-called frequencies or hauntology that run through your culture, your history, your family's history, and now your work?
Well, I mean, I've always been aware of it. I was, my father, my mother, there was also things, also class discrepancies I was always aware, I was made aware of. My mom is like really well educated and from a higher class in Jamaica. My dad was illiterate and he was from a much lower class in Jamaica, and they came here and they met, and obviously in Jamaica they may well not have been together. Here it was different, and what happens is when people immigrate, countries basically look at immigrants and just go, they're all the same, and there's no sort of kind of polarity or understanding. And of course they come from a place which heavily is colonialism. Jamaica was a colony, so those kind of structures of being fair skinned to darker skin, colorism, all those things are in there. Those kind of complexities that I grew up with, but also the idea of, my father said to me, you're born in a country that is basically telling you don't belong here and they don't want you.
So he was saying that to you from a very early age?
He said that to me. He said, I've got to, your mum and I have to basically prepare you for this. It's difficult for you because you're not Jamaican, you're born here. But you will be told that you're X, but actually there's a reality to this. But you will have to understand that you're going to have to work twice as hard as anybody else, because you're going to have to, you can't get in trouble with the law. He was sort of like giving me a framework to survive in Britain at that period in time. And my dad was complex. I mean, and then my mum was educated, so she was coming the other side. You've got to get educated. You have to be and then they teach me about. I'd get history at school, and then they teach me about what would be the role of the black history. Figures, things like that. There was a really interesting thing. When I got sent back to Jamaica, taking back my mum, and she said, I wanted you. And when we spoke the other day about it, she said, we took you back to Jamaica to see where your family came from. That this idea that you're seeing on TV in England is not a true picture. And also, she also took me back for this weird kind of thing of where she said, you have family in the countryside and you have family in the city, and there are some who are richer and there are some who are poor. And I wanted you to learn about the idea that no matter what level you're on, you help people. Such a kind of, my mum she worked in the public sector, in the NHS. She appears in a video as a metaphor. She was a health visitor. And that was another thing, as a metaphor for what she contributed to this country, despite what she had to go through. My father as well, despite what they had to go through. So from an early age, they taught me about those things. You do not get, like the police. When the police are around, you make sure you get a receipt when you go into the shop. Because people think about a kind of racism is about overt name calling. It's about an attitude towards you and how you can't control your own representation or how you negotiate the space. Like appearing to be like, there was, you hear about angry black man or the angry black woman, when actually they were just being assertive, which would be read differently if that's someone else. And it's about those complexities. And I grew up in the black country, which was very much a post-industrial town. So I grew up in a black country, was in the West Midlands. Then I had other family in Handsworth, other family in Smethwick, all around the West Midlands. Andrew Jackson, who's a photographer, comes from Dudley. Our experience is slightly different from my cousins who grew up in Handsworth, even though we all sort of hung out, because the nature of the landscape, the space. The Black Country is it's a kind of a monoculture, and it's not a monoculture. So it's not like Birmingham. It's completely different. It has a particular cultural particularities. So I was growing up in that space, and dealt with race. And there was a pub called a Lagoon Pub, which always had members of the BNP or political fractions like that. The West Midlands itself, the Rivers of Blood, Enoch Powell comes out of there. Handsworth, like the riots. I grew up with all that stuff, seeing what was going on in Britain. Stephen Lawrence. So for me, there was this. And it was always came back to this thing. When I talk about hauntology, it comes really much. Mark Fisher's sort of been attributed, but it really comes from Derrida, from Spectre Marx. And one of the things that I really cited with me was he said it wasn't the ghost, it's these spirits. And for me in this country, in this melancholy.
So can I just stop to unpack that just a little bit? So when you say it's not the ghost, it's the spirit. It's not the ghost because that's the thing. The spirit is the frequency. It's the tone that runs through things.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ghost can reappear along the way, but it's the spirit that
is the underlying thing that
runs. It's the nameless thing that.
Yeah. That's how I sort of take that and reimagine that through the work. And for me, there's something that's been seen. It's this idea of this apparent loss in this country of a greatness, but one that's attributed to a particular kind of idea that there's been the culture has been made impure by the other and the outsider, and a particular kind of positioning. And Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood, I've seen that idea, that conceptual framework appear again and again and again. And for example, let's say, why is it that we saw it with the England footballers, for example. One of the things I said, my friend reminded me, when the penalties came and you went, I hope they do not miss.
It's in the Euros. Yeah.
And it happened. And I knew what was going to happen. And, that there was a particular reaction and demographic who, you have to ask yourself the question, why they feel that they can do that. And the thing is, the way it works, people go, it appears more visceral in working class areas from a physical point of view. But it exists in all different classes, the racism. But what connects them together is an idea that as a group of people, they are more superior than people who are basically black and brown colour, so they can say what they want to them. And that is something that an undermining and this kind of attitude. And so that is related to these same ideas, this same frequency flows through. We've seen it again and again, and Brexit for me really raised those kind of positionings again even more. Because it sort of
crystallised so for a moment the ghost appeared, if you like, using your analogy, that you can because the current, I mean, as I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to sort of try and make sure I understand this because it's not my experience. It's not. You're explaining something that you've lived with your entire life, explicitly and implicitly, and when I've talked to you in the past about this, and I've got sort of an inkling of it, I realise now that the spirit of racism, and let's just call it what it is. It is basically just in different forms. It takes different.
It's
prejudice. We can say it's whether it's conscious or unconscious or whatever, is this tone which has been set in play by, say, the history of this country, let's say from our colonial past to our post-colonial present, if you like, but some of those attitudes and prejudices and race and the racism that went with that has continued. It ducks down underneath the line, so you can't spot it. but it's there.
It's there. You can spot
For
it,
you
but
to-
it's hidden in particular because people think it's just an overt. It's about language and attitude, and so for me, seeing that kind of, and it really is about a particular kind of English nationalism that is framework, as I said, in an idea of a monoculture and superiority and victimhood, and that's what's sold down, and it's politicized, it's used politically, and that's what's in the video about how these sit through. It's also about that, but through the video. So one of the analogies that goes through is the idea of working class solidarity and fracturing as well, and the idea of things, mentioned about the idea of opacity, which comes from Edward Glissant from Martinique, who's a writer, thinker, and this idea of opacity, things you don't understand, and difference. A true portrait of a person is there'll be things that you don't understand, but you understand that and you accept that, rather than being I don't understand that, so I'm going to hate you for it, and that kind of regisering racism.
So is opacity, say, the failure of one person to understand that the person, that another person isn't just the surface area?
It's a particular way of thinking, which is binary, which he cites very much this kind of Western Christian kind of thinking of good. There's just good and evil and whatever. And what I'm saying is, it's much more complex and complicated and richer than that. And there are these, even the video, there are these complexities in there. There's also these paradoxes. There's also these things there and irrationalities. And so, I guess one of the things we're going to say in the terms of the way that the video works, not just in that sense of an aesthetic strategy, because like I always say, there are these ideas or philosophical ideas, but it's still a visual. I don't write about it; it's a visual piece.
Yeah,
is this layering, this idea of layering and things under the surface and things coming through, but this whole thing of like industrial spaces died or were killed off by neoliberalism, which allowed people to generation were then co-opted to dancing. So you have this kind of new ritual and labour going on, which then itself has been turned into entertainment and washed away its kind of deeper sort of complex histories to just have entertainment. And then those venues and spaces are now being removed and transformed into the ultimate commodity, which is property and housing. So, and also about the reason why I talk about Longbridge, which basically you have the
Longbridge being the car plant.
The car plant.
Yeah.
In Birmingham.
Yeah.
That I had uncles who worked there, and it was just talking about there was these group of people who were working class, who were not just white. They were like Southern Asian, they were black, Afro-Caribbean, who worked in these places, and that removal affected all of them. It didn't just affect one group. And it was about this kind of complexity and then how it destroys, or if not destroys, but affects communities around it. But yet, it will be sold in as something else politically by people.
So, sorry, how do you mean? Sorry, when you say it'll be sold, what, the generation, the regeneration?
Well, all of it, there's regeneration, but there's also the ideas that basically...
Watch your
Oh, sorry.
Now, let me just... Yeah.
Basically, that was down to a kind of a framework of neoliberalism, that basically we're going to take this car company, we're going to basically... It doesn't matter about the effects, it's going to be sold on to somebody else. Those workers they're going to lose their jobs, but that's kind of basically the way it's going to be, through policy, through other reasons. And then when the communities are struggling or dying, they're either blamed that it's their own fault, or they're going to one group of people, it's their fault. They're taking your amenities, they're taking what's left of what you've got. And they've never added anything to it. And I've seen that happen from my grandparents, to my mother, to myself and now to younger family members and cousins and friends' families. This constant kind of fracture, this constant polarisation which was brought in.
So they're caught in the crossfire of political developments beyond their control, and they're. I wouldn't. I mean, they're.
I wouldn't say control. It's not because basically also they become used as the collateral, as the material in order to be. And it's not just political, it's also, what I'm saying, it's more layered than that. It's also ideological. It's within the framework of the country's thinking by some group of people.
Yes, it's like saying any political party will say we're striving for zero unemployment. But what they all know is that you've got to have a pool of unemployed people in order for the economy to exist. But nobody admits that. So they maintain a minimum, at the very least, and that, of people who are out of work at any given time. And so that kind of makes it easier to say we're going to, change this area, remove.
I think it's kind of more than that. I think the way I would look at it, to be honest, it's like saying, okay, for example, you're going to then remove a factory. Very simple. You're going to remove a factory or a place of employment that employs lots of people in that area, and then not really consider what is going to replace that, and then what affects that afterwards. So those people can't find jobs. Then to travel to another part of another city is maybe really expensive. It's all the other things on top of that layer on it, and then of course there's a knock-on effect of kind of then austerity takes away the local library or the youth centre. So then these communities, as you know, with Oxford there's Blackbird Leys, which I've been lucky enough to have some interaction with through Q Fusion, and you see how that whole demographic has been treated in a place like Oxford as a city. It's a classic example of what happens there, and people are then marginalised from spaces they don't feel that they're allowed to go into.
So in the terms of Oxford, there's very much two Oxfords, isn't there?
Two Oxfords, yeah.
Yeah, I mean there's the what they call, well, no, it's not even the town and gown, it's which side of the bridge are you on? Are you inside the bridges or are you outside the bridge? But beyond that there's the ring road, isn't there? And
where Blackbird Leys is in Cowley, which has also the Cowley car park, which employed lots of people. So that's what I'm talking about is those kind of those are the things that I touch upon as well. But also not just this thing, there is also resistance. What I'm saying is like also there's resistance, there's joy and pain are all in one thing, and for me that has been an experience of both finding joy and resistant outlets in different ways, and there's a kind of materiality too that I engage in as well.
And that sort of is reflected in the work, in the sense that you couldn't say this work is about one thing, and nor is it morally about one thing. I mean, it's not saying, like you said earlier, there's this, when you're talking about opacity, there isn't this sort of belief in good and bad. There isn't, that experience isn't in your
I'm just saying it's not as simple as that. Things are more complex than that. But the way things are shaped by certain groups is that there just is, and then they can say this is how history is, and it's one thing or another. And it's generally shaped by the people who are in control, and an idea of it's this corrosiveness that's always put in place. So, for example, the idea of woke is always thrown around, and it's like, well, if you're into history, you'll talk about history as a whole, but that's not what a certain demographic are talking about. They're talking about a history that fits into a narrative that really is about power, and that's what it is. And so I'm also talking about the idea of also this kind of mix and the complexities of being in that mix, being born here, and an idea of You know, the Linford Christie documentary is a fantastic documentary. You know, I was an athlete, and I understand, you know, this man who then was basically, you know, he'd won the Olympics. He was this famous, apparently national treasure, who still was stopped in his car. He was referred to as the lunchbox. You know, for him it was demeaning. You know, it was, you know, he was, oh, it's just a bit of banter. And it's like, no, actually, why is it that you framed him in that way? So what he's saying, and it's the same as the Windrush scandal, and that, what I'm talking about, that instability, that uncertainty, that you're never, ever quite enough.
Yeah,
and I think that's what the video also kind of taps into. Now, people might say, well, that's your thinking, your paranoia. And I say, it is a black experience. But the reality is there's no... You can see, if you're really going to be honest, you can see how those things have been shaped.
So this leads us on to so something that came out of the show recently, and one of the reasons that we agreed to sit down today and talk about this. I'm going to start again. Sorry. Take three. Take three. Okay. So, Jermaine, this leads on to something that's happened recently. And full disclosure, we actually recorded this interview once before. But the incident that Jermaine's going to recount in a moment happened in the course or around the time that we made that recording. And Jermaine asked if we could re-record the interview in light of what had happened, because what had happened was significantly upsetting and illustrative of some of the themes, or much of many of the themes that Jermaine's been exploring in this work. So, Jermaine, do you want to explain what happened and give it the full context?
I mean, it's not my first rodeo in this situation, so, but I think it was, and it's, and the thing is, it is a part of the work. This kind of whole story is a part of what the work is supposed to be dealing with, and maybe kind of massaging or a conduit for the dialogue, and that's what I think work is about. But, you know, there was a group of people came, and there was one person who was a photographer, and they had been through the show, made some comments, and then we watched the video, and one of the questions that they asked was about, in the video, and there's the conversation about how black people were kept out of clubs, were not allowed into clubs. And this particular thing is set in Liverpool, but that happened across the country in different places. It's not an unknown thing, and actually still happens today. You have young people say that who are black or brown skinned or different demographics. It was like, and back then it was almost like a colour bar, and it was about, what happened is there was these social clubs from Sierra Leone, from the sailors who came over from Sierra Leone. There was these social clubs in Liverpool, and they became spaces where people from all backgrounds used to go because they were friendly, they were cheap. You know, people could have a cheap drink and have a time together, and it was a real kind of showing of a sort of mix and a solidarity between groups within these classes. But it also talks about the way, you know, black people kept out of clubs, nightclubs. And, you know, we go into rave culture, but there are friends of mine who, I'm not going to name who are black, who weren't allowed in some parties, some clubs. They weren't, and that indicated. And then we get into, you know, and in the audio piece, I talk about coming back from a party, and then basically Stephen Lawrence has been killed. So it was about this idea that there was this thing going on, but there was also still going on in society was this overt sort of racial violence, things like that. Anyway, what happened was that this person questioned the validity of that story or that experience of black people being kept out of nightclubs, and
And as I understood it, she had some knowledge of the area that you were of the sort of club world that you were talking about.
She has some knowledge. She's of an age that would have been there. I'm a little bit younger, but I was at particular parties. She's white, and she questioned what, she was asking what this particular had to do with it, and when I sort of explained what was the background to that and the history, it was questioned. Now, I think also it was questioned in the sense of a time period, and I said, no, this still goes on. It's not.
So she was denying your experience. She was denying.
I think what was happening, it was a undermining.
Right.
It could be a questioning, and there was a questioning, and everyone has the right to critique and question work.
Yeah.
What happened was that when the question was answered, and also it's not like the material has been made up by me, it's testimonies and material that's in there, and it's not a not known. And then what I tried to explain was, well, the idea of sound systems, the idea of the house party, the blues party, all those things, which have also influenced dance music, spaces, clubs, the whole culture. And then that stuff, it was still questioned. And I got into the point of also talking about the idea of house music coming here at a certain point, but actually Greg Wilson and Jeremy Deller has shown up perfectly in his film, that, it was existing in Moss Side much earlier on in these young black clubs, and they talk about it in that video. So it's not like something we have, and I said, well, what do you think Small Axe is about as well? So it was this, and it was almost like it felt like it could not be accepted because it didn't fit into their narrative.
Yeah.
And going back to the idea of this work saying it's from a black temporality, I said, well, that's the thing. That person wouldn't have to think about those things, where someone like me would.
Yeah.
And that is the point. And and that's what happened. But what was also quite revealing was the idea of, goes back to a nostalgia and almost a mythology of a particular period of time. And I was trying to say that wasn't the experience for everybody, and not everybody is in those spaces, and that did not change the wider framework of the country, probably.
Right. And can I just sort of to summarize it in a way, there are the facts, and you can, in a way, as you said, you can question and you can critique, and that's completely normal, and you can clarify and seek clarification. But in this case, she wasn't interested in discovering the facts. She was more interested in postulating that you were wrong for whatever reason. She wanted to impose herself on your story.
Yeah.
And that was that for me, when you told me about this the other day, that was the moment, the sort of extraordinary light bulb moment where I just thought, no, that is it. That is exactly what
it was. A sense of imposing their narrative rather than an idea of curiosity and discovery.
Yeah.
Rather than going, and that's what I found really interesting. But that is something that this video reflects and deals with. That kind of attitude is that, no, well, that didn't happen. And then there was another comment that was made, which I can't be bothered to go into, which I found highly problematic, which was suggesting only certain clubs. It was just kind of, it kind of summed up the comment itself. The language of the comment was like, okay, well, that just doubles down and sums up and it was like, well, that's what the video talks about. It talks about that frequency, and it talks about that attitude. And I'm sure this person would not see themselves as being any way aligned with someone who was on the right or right wing. They would probably see themselves as quite liberal in their position. But what they failed to understand is that they failed to accept and engage and think about what was placed in front of them, and yet still felt that they had the authority to impose their position, even though those facts are there, or even to go and look and discover those facts. You know, for example, when we're in Oxford,
Or you could put it another way, but she just couldn't accept her position in the conversation, the power. You know, I think she assumed power in a completely instinctive way.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, but that is also a case, but that is, you know, that's what the video also deals with those kind of things, and it's not like I'm averse to, you know, in Oxford. Remember, there was the man who asked about when we were giving the presentation about A Pleasant Land, and he was saying, "Do you think black people should be in those paintings by Turner?" And I said, "No." And
he was sort of like saying, he was challenging you to revise history.
And I wasn't saying that, and I clarified with him what I was trying to talk about was a relationship, and you know, and he was saying, okay, and what was interesting was that when he went to the exhibition, and we'd had this conversation, he wanted me to clarify, and when he came out of the exhibition, it was interesting. He turned around to me and he came up to me and said, "I get it now. I've been and seen the work. I understand it. Yeah, I got it quite wrong in what I was thinking. It's made me think." And he said, "It's really made me think." He said, "I think," and he also said, "I think the work's beautiful," which was really a nice compliment. But for me, it's not about the fact that he liked the work. It's the fact that he said, "It's made me think, actually. That's made me think. Now I kind of understand where we're going with this. It's made me think." And so that, for me, is like, yeah, he challenged me. And also, there was the clarification that maybe, because some of the things I was explaining were quite late, and I might not have put them in, articulated them in the clearest sense. But what was different here, that there was kind of a fact put in front of me in a testimony that ran through, and yet, even when it was clarified, even when the work was seen, it came from the other way, that basically, because he hadn't seen the work, he'd done it in reverse, and then he saw the work and went, "Oh." And that's what it's about for me, it's the work. I can't explain, some of these things I can't explain them in a kind of didactic sense, because sometimes it's about sensation experiencing. This was very different because they'd experienced the work, they'd asked the question, they'd seen a particular bit, which was actually the clearest bit of testimony, but because it didn't fit into their narrative, or didn't seem to fit into the narrative, and I thought that that theirs was the only single narrative what was going on at that point in time, and not understanding, and why that, you know, I found that kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, that's what the video is about.
And I mean, as a sort of just an addendum, the gallery has written on, you know, to complain about the comments. So it does have a sort of, if you like, a formal. There's no line being drawn under it, but it has been noted officially that, you know, these comments, and.
I think the thing what's interesting is that for me, because it's not my first rodeo in that situation, and this is what you do, is that you go, all right, I'm gonna have to, and then you kind of like put it like, here we go again, I've had that before. And you sort of, because that's how you, and that is it, you've had to negotiate the country, you've had to negotiate, how do I negotiate that? How does that get dealt with? But what I'm saying is, you know, and I'm gonna, it was so clear what was going on. So, you know, it's that thing of where there you have again those fractures and solidarities in spaces, or solidarities or acknowledgement and talks, and somebody on behalf going, I'm going to, you know, those things are there. It's
because ignorance isn't a crime, but willful ignorance or blind prejudice is, if you like, it's like.
Well, the point is that, you know, at the end of the day, if someone's made you aware of something, and you're not willing to be curious to investigate it and not acknowledge it, and then I would feel it's a problem. It's like somebody saying like misogyny doesn't exist when it's so overtly clear that it does exist. It's like, someone tells you that the door is brown and you can see it's blue and they've got blue paint in their hand and you've just seen them paint it and they say, no, that's not what you're seeing.
That is exactly it.
It's kind of like, well,
okay. But that's it, and it's a denial of you.
It's a denial of you, but then it gets thrown back onto you to question yourself about the experience that you've had or people have had with you, and so you basically start this thing where you can start asking yourself, you start questioning yourself. But actually, there was no question there. It's there, it's clear and simple. And that person has decided in their heads, in that moment in time, well, that doesn't play with and I call it temporality. They haven't looked at a temporality that's different, an idea of an experience or a space. And that's what the work is also about, the idea of temporality, of experience, different temporalities within spaces and groups, and how that does affect things and how that can play out. So, and that's kind of what it's dealing with. So that, for me, was an articulation of a temporality of this subject, of this country, of that space. So it was kind of like it was a metaphor because it was in real time, but that's what I've experienced as well.
Well, I've seen it before at first hand.
You've seen it before.
Yeah, and it's shocking. I'm shocked because it's because you suddenly realise that there are people, who would, like you said, consider themselves to be liberals, whatever that means, on the left in every way, but actually are completely unaware that their prejudices that they have a prejudice which is which they can't resist at times, and and I wouldn't, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. I couldn't have believed the blatancy of what was said to you by somebody once. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, and the thing is, like
and
I
you've
said,
experienced this.
Yeah, and that's
as you
just
say,
a normal
it's not your
experience.
first rodeo.
It's not my first rodeo, and that's what it's talking about. That kind of unease, the things you have to think about when you're going, and then suddenly you hit with that. And there's a lot of also black women artists who talked about it for years and being in those spaces or so-called feminist spaces, and then them experience, and it's this kind of paradox that you have. It's like, okay, well, and it's that thing of also being aware of your own. I'm trying to be quite self-critical at times, trying to do and see if I'm being complete, because to not acknowledge that you don't have these things inside of you is arrogant. To believe that you're not complicit in any way, I think it's healthy. Even in terms of photography, like when I say to students, think about your own power in that relationship. You are part of that relationship. In the same way as Dreamscape, with what Martha Rosler talks about in culture class, it sort of reverts to the idea of how subcultures, art, all these things get wrapped in or complicit in the idea of gentrification, that it's not outside of that, it's used as a tool within kind of developers, studio spaces, the coffee shop, and then all these language they use, like in this, the Summer of Love is a facade, which is part of a development that's going to sell really expensive properties in Coal Drops Yard, where I used to live around the corner of the Caledonian Road, like artistic or come for you, and you're like, well, where's the art? Like, I don't really understand it. It's not. It's cultural capitalism.
Yeah, well, that's what Grayson Perry
cultural
said.
Currency, as I would say.
Because Grayson Perry says if you're a developer and you've got some shitty neighbourhood and you want to make it more valuable, just send in the artists. They'll make it valuable.
Well, that's and that's what Martha Rosler talks about in culture class and in New York and the gentrification.
And what role do you think the artist has in that? What responsibility do you think the artist has in that, in that process of complicity? To put it another way, can the artist remain completely separated from those ideas and just carry on doing what they do, or should the artist be activist in countering those ideas?
Difficult one, because not all artists are I think activism and art, can sing hand in hand, and some artists are overtly political, some aren't. But there's, I always had that analogy of kind of, well, the last time I saw Alan Secular's work was in a gallery, and he was talking about operating outside of that in a weird way with a document.
Well, that's that. Yeah, I mean.
So that's what I'm talking about in that sense. So I think that we should be aware of where we sit in that, and the complexity and complicity in that. I think we can't just say that we're not aware of it. I think we have to. What do we do about it? I mean, that's the thing. We have to think about what's our role and what we do. What's the role in institutions? There was a period, I guess, when artists, it was brilliant with Blackbird Lee, seeing how artists worked within communities. I think that was really important and really interesting, that people from different backgrounds or demographics got to engage in art or in some kind of engagement which brought some people together. And I think it's increasingly difficult as well. In the way that, because also in order to make work, you've got to have some kind of, you've got to have to live. You have to have some this idea that basically, this romanticised idea, you can have that romanticised idea if you're wealthy. If you're not, then, there's people lecturing, there's people trying to go, there's people looking for grants, there's people doing all other jobs in order to make work. And I guess it's what, I don't have this attitude as well when it comes, because remember, there was a period where black abstract artists were marginalised because they weren't making figurative work because of, and Stuart Hall pointed and Bell Hooks talking about this idea of an agenda. And I don't want that either, That I want, I don't want to say, well, their work's not overtly political. So actually, what's its point when you've got somebody like, Rachel Jones, who's shown at Dulwich Picture Gallery, whose work is, in all many different facets, powerful, strong work that talks about so many different things on so many different levels in a different way.
And it denies a sort of form, like
it's not didactic. It's not presenting a didactic position on things.
Yeah.
Is that seen less overt, or than somebody who's making work that's didactic and saying that this is, that's not always the case. And also, who's seeing the work as well? I think that's the point about an audience. Who sees a work?
I mean, that's a huge subject, isn't it? I mean, because who is this work for? I mean, one of the things that interests me is, it's a thing that I think of about photography a lot, is why do we publish these books, make these exhibitions for other photographers and for other people who buy books, when the work is generally is of a documentary nature, so it's of a more general, sort of global nature. And one of the interesting things about what's happened here in this exhibition now is that let's call it the incident, was a direct connection with the real world, if you like. So taking the theory on the walls and it becoming practice in real time in that moment.
I think it's also like spaces like, where I studied in Warsaw for my foundation, and New Warsaw Art Gallery. I think that's a really great gallery. It does feel like people, like, for example, people feel like they can go in there. I mean, I know Kirsty Mackay did Magic Money, and that was made, some of it in Tipton, which is literally 10, 15 minutes up the road on the bus, 10 minutes on the bus. And so, the whole space itself, that children coming, local communities coming. I don't know how successful that is in the sense of, do people feel like they, I know growing up in those areas, a lot of people like myself didn't feel you could go into those spaces, whether it being working class as well. But I think like Deborah, who's there, I think she's really trying to create a space where people can come in and experience those things. I don't think there should be this attitude that people from certain backgrounds don't have the ability to engage in work. I just don't think they're encouraged to. to do that. They're not encouraged to be in those spaces. And I think that's also a kind of problem I have, that like, well, why do you think I got into it? I used to go to galleries and go to a library, and my auntie took me, and then my art teacher took me and got me into, and, you know, I was astounded to think about, like, oh my God, there's this whole world out there that thinks, might allow me to think, show me a different world or a different experience. And I think for me that's really accessibility as well, even education's another thing as well, accessibility in that.
Well, I think we ought to sort of draw things to a close, but what are you working on in, you know?
I think this show is going to a space in Rome, and then I'm continuing to work on this Odyssey project, which is about kind of a history of Black Britain. It's probably, you know, it's a sort of incomplete history in some ways. The work itself can never fully complete it, and that's also part of the work. And a relationship with, which just showed at Faceland, with, you know, Jamaica and the Caribbean, and how the labour of two lands.
Would you call it a diptych, or is it
that's montage?
Yeah,
I call it a montage. But it's also like an object. So
that was part of the
London Lives.
Yeah,
with Francis Hodgson.
The photo London this year. Yeah.
So I'm still working on that, because that's quite a body of work, and yeah, I'm working on a couple of other projects as well in the background. One with Grain, going back to Tipton.
Right.
Well, back to the West Midlands, about the canals, and as a spine to talk about a narrative, which is sort of really related to this project. So yeah, just working on those at the moment.
Great. Well, I mean, huge.
I'm trying to stay sane.
Yeah.
In the madness. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jermaine. Thank you very much.
Thanks for letting me talk.
And that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Well, it could be a cure for insomnia as well for people.
Fuck off. I don't think so.